All right, folks. FSoceity, congratulations and welcome to the final round of this year's Cyber 912 in Washington, D.C. I'll be your host and timekeeper. My name is Simon Handler. I'm the Assistant Director of the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative. Before we begin, I'm going to run down a few quick reminders on rules. Presentation aids such as PowerPoint, handouts, posters are not permitted. You may not use any electronic devices aside from the laptop that you're using for video conferencing, and you are encouraged to use written notes. If at any point you encounter technical difficulties, just keep calm and reference the Zoom link that you should have over email. So we're going to do a little bit of a different timing for this final round. We're going to have 10 minutes of presentation right off the bat, followed by a 10-minute Q&A from the judges, and then 10 minutes of feedback directly after that. So to keep time, I'm going to hold up these cards with a 5, a 1, and a stop on them throughout each round. When I say stop, if you could just wrap up the one sentence that you're on, that'd be great. Then I'm going to have to cut you off. Are there any questions at this point? All right, that's a thumbs up. So without further ado, good luck and let's get rolling.
Hello, I'm here to tell you today about a series of cascading threats affecting US national security and the international freedom of trade and navigation. There have been significant red lines that have been crossed since we have previously briefed you. To overview those now is that the Obsidian Sun inactive malware has been activated, with malware spreading to over 30,000 ships, causing immediate crisis. Additionally, terrorist group Hezbollah may have access to missile components due to the taking advantage of the missing cargo and data manipulation of cargo manifest lists. Third, there's evidence that cyber criminal groups have disrupted economic markets by short trading to take advantage of these effects. As you know, the NSC has previously activated the Cyber Unified Coordination Group, who will coordinate the various US agencies and international stakeholders involved in our policy response. Our policy options address courses of action in the short term and the long term, as we need to pay attention to what we have to do immediately in the next days to weeks, but also in the long term, how to reinforce critical maritime infrastructure and the freedom of trade, as well as address larger and retaliate against those who committed these attacks. I'll first start with what we know, what we don't know, and what we assume. So we know that there are 30,000 vessels affected and they need rescue. We know that there's missing cargo, including missing missile components that are in Beirut. And we know that Iran had access to some of the missing cargo. What we don't know how close Hezbollah is to the missiles. However, we do assume that they are close to being able to access them. We don't know the extent to which Iran is communicating with Hezbollah, but we assume that there is some level of coordination based off of their existing relationships. So this is not indicated in specifically in our intelligence brief. And we assume that if we do not take immediate action, this situation will get worse and there will be grave national security threats.
At this time, we assess that there are 3 principal threats facing the US and global maritime critical infrastructure at large. These 3 threats, the level of risk determined by these 3 threats is determined by the time horizons that we assess pertain to these 3 threats. The highest threat is the surface-to-air missile equipment that Hezbollah is attempting to access at this time. We understand that Hezbollah is aware of the missing equipment and of the equipment's misdelivery to the port of Beirut. Hezbollah has also been developing operations that we assess will continue and potentially be escalated if they were to intervene and access the equipment that is intended for US use. The second threat that we assess is the Dormant Hound attacks. We understand that 30,000 vessels have been affected by this malware and that many of them need rescuing. There is still the issue of missing cargo and 60% of the global fleet being down. The lowest threat that we assess at this time is the stock manipulation efforts started by 1881. The efforts of 1881 Collective to disrupt shipping and petroleum markets at this time may cause a windfall that will fund additional cybercrime operations, potentially escalating the existing crisis. Each of these three threats presents cascading threats on a longer time horizon to US national security, and our framework is going to attempt to address each of these three threats from a domestic perspective, as well as from an international perspective, with domestic and international partners in the public and private sectors.
Let's talk about the threat with Hezbollah getting access to surface-to-air missiles. In this case, we don't want to make things too complicated. It's pretty simple. Who is going to be willing to assume that risk? We know that someone has to go in and take care of those missiles and potentially take direct action, but we don't know quite yet whether Israel is willing to assume that risk. Therefore, what our first policy option will be, or our first policy recommendation rather, will be that JSOC, supported by other Title 10 authorities, will go into Lebanon and engage in a covert direct action towards exfiltrating those surface-to-air missiles. The reason we recommend this option versus letting Israel assume that risk is because we are seriously concerned about potential escalation. Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon have a much more fraught relationship, and we believe that JSOC and our kind of the people we have under control are much more able to assume that risk in a way that that we find acceptable from a national security perspective. Let's talk about the second problem with maritime ports, or with the stranded sailors kind of out sea. We know that if we don't act soon, a lot of these sailors could really run the risk of things like starvation, of seasickness, of lots of different types of issues kind of on the kinetic level. So our first option is to issue a joint communique from Washington to all NATO embassies, any embassy that is kind of located near a port, to send out a military, Coast Guard kind of naval task force, naval contingency that can go and rescue those sailors. The second option, which builds on the first, is to ensure that, as far as communication, that we quickly maneuver from digital communications to analog communications. So that means going from from traditional kind of non-radio based frequencies to radio based frequencies as quickly as we can. With that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Matt Brophy to discuss our final policy recommendation.
As my colleague, thank you, Andrew. As my colleague mentioned, we are facing some very serious short-term threats. For this reason, we are prioritizing the immediate threats from the Dormant Hound incident, as well as the Special Operations Mission. However, there are also some longer things that we need to think about to remediate in the long term. The ongoing activities that we have seen from Iranian threat actors manipulating cargo data will continue to cause serious problems to both the global supply chain and set up additional cascading problems, like we've seen where malicious threat actors could gain access to surface-to-air missiles, or the disruption of medical supplies, which we've seen Iran take advantage of. For this reason, we recommend that the National Security Council continue to leverage a port cyber remediation task force and an international maritime public-private partnership. We've spoken about these in earlier briefs, and these these two coordinating bodies will leverage important state and private sector actors like the U.S. Coast Guard, the Department of Transportation, CISA, the FBI, the Maritime Transportation Systems Information Sharing and Analysis Center to coordinate a response to remediate the ongoing threats from this cargo manipulation. However, it's not just enough to remediate the threats from the cargo manipulation. We also need to respond and retaliate for the malicious activity that has occurred in cyberspace. We therefore recommend an additional cyber command strike against Iranian actors for the continued disruption in cyberspace. Both of these options are long-term responses that could remediate this long-term threat, and we recommend that the National Security Council use both of these. To conclude, we're facing an unprecedented situation in cyberspace. We have crossed a red line in which terrorist actors have credible access to serious missile components, and an advanced persistent threat actor continues to disrupt critical activity like global trade. It is therefore imperative the National Security Council respond to this situation, and we have a plan. We're going to use the Port Task Force to remediate the threats to the sailors, a special operations mission to uncover the missiles, and long-term efforts to remediate the threats from cargo manipulation, and a retaliation effort from U.S. Cyber Command to retaliate against our Iranian threat actors. Thank you. We're happy to take your questions at this time.
Thank you, FSoceity. Just under 10 minutes. Nice job. We're going to now go to the judges for some questions for 10 minutes, starting now.
I got a question to start. Understanding the concern about Hezbollah and the access to the SAMs, the move, as you described it, to cowboy up with JSOC seems to be significantly risk accepting. I'm intrigued by the logic of trying to shift the risk of the existing event onto the United States and away from a regional ally, but I'm curious if you could talk through how to do that in a different way that is potentially less escalatory or less complicated in the near term.
So we considered how to work with regional allies in the Middle East to address this threat. So obviously, Israel is a close ally, but due to existing tensions, we don't think that they would be appropriate. The government of Lebanon is unstable, and their relative control over the port of Beirut is questionable. So we don't think that working directly with them is adequate, so that there needs to be additional steps. I think that a less escalatory option that you might want to consider is working with an additional regional partner. The Jordanian military has worked with the United States military in many operations in the past, including fighting ISIL. So we have great military to military coordination with them. So it's possible to bring them in and use their existing relationship with Lebanon to go in, investigate, and exfiltrate the missile components, as Jordan also does not want to see Hezbollah gain access to those missiles. So I definitely think that's an important option to consider, with the United States being kind of a more escalatory risk, but there are pros and cons to each.
Fantastic. Thank you. Appreciate that answer. Second question, we have this relatively unprecedented manipulation of the stock market, targeting some high value core firms in the United States. What is it that we feel about that risk, as you guys can describe? What is it that we feel about that risk that's not significant enough to have it even in the top two of these responses? And I'd love if you could characterize that both with respect to long-term risk, talk about the accumulation of assets to this entity, you mentioned that, but also just the near-term risk of confidence and stability in the markets.
Matt.
So looking at this specific situation in terms of the near-term risks, we have assessed that the immediate risks in the short term caused by Hezbollah's potential access to this equipment, outweighing the potential threat of the stock manipulation, as well as the direct response, the human life component and the human suffering that will happen if we cannot remediate these immediate threats from the dormant hound situation. So at this time, we're prioritizing the human life over the side of the stock market manipulation. In the long term, there are likely many options that we can consider to get after this stock manipulation, but none of this can really be solved until we remediate the specific threats in the ports and these ongoing data manipulation, which is why we therefore, in the longer term, are talking about this data manipulation before we think about the stock market.
Thank you.
I would also quickly add that to deal with the stock market manipulation, we already have evidence that we already know that the SEC is holding trading options and looking at that. So we know that those actions are currently being taken in the short run to prevent them from gaining any more money. While in the long term, we have to address the money that they have gained and the confidence in the market, public messaging will go into that. Obviously, the market is about confidence and nothing else. So a strong public messaging to the public about how the United States is dealing with this threat and we're cutting off bad actors in our markets will restore confidence in sort of the short term before we can sort of take actions to cut these cyber criminals off in the long term.
It's a good presentation. A few questions for you guys. What is Cybercom? What do you have Cybercom doing during this? During all of this?
We have specifically had Cyber Command looking into the retaliation strike against the Iranian command and control infrastructure. Sorry, the Iranian Advanced Persistent Threat Actor command and control infrastructure.
Are you not comfortable with attribution yet to launch a strike on the command and control infrastructure?
At this time, we would like a more specific forensic into the exact command and control infrastructure used. And again, we have prioritized these the human life component of the missiles and the Dormant Hound incident, and we are thinking about Cyber Command in terms of more of a long-term retaliation option. And because it's on a longer-term time horizon, we therefore have the benefit of additional investigation.
But to be clear, so I know you're prioritizing one or the other, but those are two different groups doing two different things, correct? You don't have Cyber Command involved in anything else, correct?
I think that's correct.
What are you doing domestically? Presumably, if ports are going to get disrupted and trade is going to be disrupted, what are you doing domestically to deal with potential physical fallout and shortage of goods?
So on the domestic level, we have a port remediation task force, including U.S. CERT, Coast Guard, using their Title 33 authorities to shore up security access, as well as ISACs coordinating and CISA. However, in terms of the disruption to global trade and food, we're looking at other options instead of using analog manifests to help unload critical cargo that are on ships and then distribute them via air and land to where they need to go, especially domestically. So that's a line of action.
But how? Who's doing that?
So
as my colleague mentioned, we over various iterations, briefings of the National Security Council, we have set up several task forces to help respond to these immediate threats in the port. So as Jackie mentioned, this, for example, the Cyber Port Remediation Task Force is led by CISA with complementary remediation efforts provided by U.S. CERT, as well as we also have established a public-private partnership using the Maritime Transportation System Information Sharing and Analysis Center, along with some private sector components. So leveraging the forensics investigations from the Port Cyber Remediation Task Force and then distributing this to our partners in both the public and private sectors to get understanding of best practices and some more of the technical remediation efforts.
I would add to that fact that we also have the Cyber Unified Coordination Group coordinated with CISA, and we plan to use every technique possible to not only switch to analog for any time horizon that we need to get shipping up and running, but also ensuring that any unaffected vessels or unaffected ports are able and willing to assist those vessels and ports that need extra remediation bandwidth and strength from our allies and partners with whom we will be in constant communication for information sharing purposes and gathering additional reconnaissance.
To follow up on John's question and the points made by Matthew and others on prioritizing the safeguarding of human life in terms of the proposals that you surfaced. You list as your very first proposal a covert direct action to exfiltrate the missiles. That is a very significant primary recommendation, given potential risks, given potential for unsuccessful outcomes. What are your risk mitigation plans if things were to go awry? And what is the basis for having such a volatile activity as your primary and foremost recommendation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And we understand that it is a high risk situation. It's high risk whether we assume the risk and kind of go in and kind of take that direct action. It's also high risk if we choose not to direct that action. So we're dealing with that in either way. As far as risk mitigation for a specific recommendation, as Matt, my colleagues Matt and Jackie pointed out, we do have partners in the region. We have a lot of friends there, and that's significant. Jackie referenced a potential option we could pursue with the government of Jordan. They've expressed, time and time again, they've kind of come to our side to help remediate any kind of on the tactical side, also on the operational side, to coordinate and make sure that we're kind of keeping in line with international humanitarian law and staying strict to that as far as reducing collateral. So we also have Israel in the region. They've been a good friend, and we also have a surrounding. NATO's just north of that region, and so we can always work to leverage our partnerships with them to ensure that we have as much intelligence on the situation as possible, and if we do take an action, that it's as coordinated and kind of focused as possible. Oh, thanks, Simon.
Yep, that's going to do it for the question and answer portion of the round. We are going to go this time directly into feedback. We have a really great panel of judges. Judges, if you wouldn't mind just remembering to introduce yourselves, that'd be great. Thanks.
When do you want to lead off? I know we didn't get a chance to get to you during the comments.
Okay, sure. I'm Wendy Nather, and I lead the advisory CISO team for Duo Security. I've been a CISO in the public and private sectors, an industry analyst, and I worked for the retail ISAC. Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciated that you kept it down to 3 main topics that you were going to speak to, and that you ranked them very clearly in terms of priority and so on. I think most of my comments have to do with the I would say the interesting solutions that you decided to pick on. I think one of the questions that I would have asked on the surface-to-air missile equipment, and it's not clear from the inject whether it's just equipment or whether it is an entire, ready to assemble missile. But my question would be, who faces the greatest immediate risk from Hezbollah getting access to it? Is it us? Is the purpose of that acquisition to help them with their program? Is this going to be a long-term thing? Is this really a proliferation issue? Or is it, as soon as they lay their hands on this missile, they're going to shoot it at Israel? In which case, you may have a huge problem with Israel saying, what, you didn't call us? And so those are some of the things that I would consider when coming up with the options for that. For the idea of asking NATO to rescue ships, I assume that a lot of these are not our ships. They're not US ships. That all of the ones that are hit by the malware are global. So do we ask NATO just to help our ships? Do we ask them to help all NATO ships? How do we coordinate that? And do we feel as though, will our ships feel as though they're being deprioritized in the crowd of, what NATO is trying to rescue? Are they going to come back to us and say, never mind what NATO's doing, come get us? So that's another question that came to my mind. I liked the idea of downgrading to analog communications. I would just wonder how complete that would be, what that would involve, and how long you would need to do that before you could restore regular digital operations. And interesting that you jumped right to the idea of an offensive cyber strike. And I didn't hear a lot of reasoning why we felt that was a good option at this time, other than, well, gosh, we got to retaliate. So yeah, I guess I was a little unclear on the motivations behind that. Other than that, thank you very much. Good answering the questions, even though I didn't get any questions in.
Hey, my name's John. Background, former Commerce, DAS, Intel and Security, led the second task force at Solarium and spent 3 years. It says those were 3 long years. So a few things you guys need to consider. One is you got to include Israel. If for no other reason, then you need to shape them. If you leave them out of the room, there's a good chance they take unilateral action, and the U.S. was going to have to deal with that. Second of all, I would have liked to have heard some considerations around civil options. This is, it's worth considering this is a non-proliferation issue, not necessarily a military issue, especially when you prescribe something that is itself going to be fairly escalatory. I know there's trust issues with the Lebanese government, but at the same time, I would have liked to have heard a comparison about why or why not you did that. Second, think about it like this. The U.S. government certainly has, from a cyber perspective, a redundancy perspective, has some sort of responsibility to, replace digital communications with analog, or to try to help with shipping manifests. But it's also got to, recreate a logistics network. And there's one institution that really does well with logistics networks, and it's the U.S. military. Would like to heard some things about defense support to civil authorities or invocation of the National Guard. Something to consider is whether this qualifies as a national emergency and brings up, FEMA funding, which would solve a lot of problems when it comes to paying people to do things. I think finally, cybercom. I would keep this in mind, is there's various levels of attribution. Using cybercom as a retaliatory measure is only one thing that they can do. Instances of an attack for defensive purposes, and I'm not splitting hairs, to mitigate some of the bleeding is also something cybercom can do. You don't necessarily need attribution, hard attribution, to attack, say, command and control infrastructure to stop an attack. So one thing that I would have liked to have heard is a consideration of using cybercom to interdict or stop an attack rather than as purely a retaliatory measure. Just something to consider for the future.
I'll echo the judges. It was a good presentation. I think two substantive notes on what is a very good patina. The one is the consideration of the timeline of risk with respect to the loose SAMs. I think Wendy's point about whether it's missiles or components is a good and deliberate inclusion. But the timeline of that risk is something I would have loved to see a little more consideration of. But I do appreciate that you went right after it, and that you addressed it, you didn't ignore it and try to stick into the cyber issues. The second issue, I think, at least that raised in my mind, was the within domain response. You've got all the tools of statecraft available to you. Cybercom or not, you don't have to reply in the same domain that we saw this risk or that we're engaged in this risk. So I think I would have liked to see a little bit more discussion of what it is that you wanted to achieve and why a cyber response may have been the best path to that end. That said, the team dynamic is really strong, and the feed from Jackie to Matt, at one point, I can't remember what question it was really good. And that is a hard thing to have done under pressure. But that's exactly the kind of response that we're going to look for as we're looking for the right answer if you guys have divvied up subject matter expertise. I also thought the pivot to Jordan was very strong. It's good inclusion of an ally. It's a strong regional player. There's plenty of precedent for them to be involved in trying to chase after missiles. And that's a good way to address that. The only other thing I just ask as you're thinking about this future, one is make sure all your lights are going to stay on, for the full time. Your presentation always tricky. No points off there for sure. But the other is just the SEC response. That works if it's your solution. So bring that up in the beginning. Don't force us to dig for it. I think that was a good response to say this process is already underway and we're going to let that run to do its thing. Just flag that for us up top, because we're definitely going to ask if there's sort of a missing rec.
Hi, everybody.
also lead at Facebook and come to the private sector from a long career at the Department of Justice and on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'll start off with what I thought was really good, which is the sort of organization of the presentation. You were very clear in terms of what we know, what we don't know, and what we assume. I thought that was a nice sort of preamble in terms of going into what the proposals were. You also were clear at the beginning in terms of US versus global threats, and you ranked those. It took a little bit of time to get to what the proposals were. And so again, know your audience in some of this. And this is an audience of bandwidth-strapped decision makers who have differing equities in terms of the roles and the organizations that they represent. So sometimes you want to have that organization, but you also want to sort of cut to the chase very quickly. I was struck by the sort of nuclear options that were your primary recommendations. And when you're going to go for the jugular, if you will, with some of those high risk propositions, I think you're going to want to justify them. And the sort of justification was, well, human life's at risk. Human life's at risk with almost everything that comes before the NSC. And human life is at risk when we're even just talking about pure cyber vulnerabilities. If we're talking about hospitals, if we're talking about schools, if we're talking about power plants. And so that was not unique to this particular threat. You could even have a far more benign threat that would have the same level of potential human impact. So for a nuclear option to be your first and primary one, I think you really want to have strong underlying support, as well as mitigations teed up pretty clearly. The NATO point that Wendy raised, that was interesting, and that caught my eye because you were like, we're going to have a global communique go out. And as in terms of a policy recommendation, are we potentially creating a lot of global thrush, unease, uncertainty? Are we asking for help from partners that don't have resources to spare? Are we creating diplomatic tension or uncertainty in places where we don't need to cause that churn? And so sort of looking at tertiary effects of potential recommendations, I think is something that one always wants to do. Not only in an NSC mock-up, as we just did, but in anything that you do, both as emerging professionals and as career professionals. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.